in the late 160s AD to produce the unprecedented pressure that was being felt on the Danube frontier, including the southern migration of the Goths in the far north, which pushed everyone else south, an increased level of political cooperation between the German tribes, which seemed to break the spell of divide and conquer that the Romans had always been able to weave so successfully, and of course, as I've already mentioned, the shift of legionary strength to the east, which left the borders more porous than they had ever been before. It all added up to an emboldened German population, perhaps even a desperate population, if you believe that the migrating Goths were pushing the southern tribes to seek settlement within the empire or face death, that was more willing than ever to go and have it out with Rome on the battlefield. In 166 or early 167, a confederation of tribes invaded Pannonia, but they were repulsed by a collection of local auxiliaries led by the governor Marcus Bassus. Bassus was concerned enough by the situation and his own limited military resources that he called a conference of the major tribes that was formally mediated by the Marcomannic king Balimer, who was, at least in theory, a trustworthy client of Rome, but in practice was about to prove one of their greatest adversaries. The conference ended with renewed pledges from everyone to respect the borders, but just a few months later, a combined army invaded Lower Moesia and managed to kill the governor of the province during the subsequent fighting. Back in Rome, Marcus and Lucius watched these events unfold, with an alarm magnified by the fact that the city and the legionary camps of the empire were being crippled by the Antonine Plague. They could barely keep the existing legions staffed. Raising new forces was, for the moment, unfeasible. But in 168, they were able to muster 2 new legions and safely think about traveling north to inspect the borders for themselves. The co-emperors set up a headquarters in the northern Italian city of Aquileia, and from there headed up to the Danube to get first-hand reports from the soldiers who had suddenly found themselves in a war zone. It was while the emperors were returning to Aquileia from the front during the winter of 168-169 that Lucius came down with a severe sickness. At the time, it was diagnosed as food poisoning, but many think he came down with the same plague that was ravaging the empire. Whatever the cause, after a few days lingering in bed, Lucius died in early 169. In some respects, it was surprising that Lucius, still in his 30s, would so suddenly die, but given his family medical history, the fact that Lucius lasted as long as he did is perhaps the greater surprise. Remember that his father Lucius Caesar was so often bedridden that people thought it insane that Hadrian would even choose him to be heir. Though the situation on the Danube was of pressing concern, Marcus nonetheless accompanied the body of his brother back to Rome, where an elaborate funeral was staged, complete with a set of memorial games, the kind that Marcus so despised and Lucius so loved. Since I am, even as we speak, entertaining an influential diplomat from the People's Republic of Portland, I am taking next week off, but in 2 weeks, we'll accompany Marcus as he heads back north alone, now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. For the next decade, the frozen front line along the Danube will be Marcus's home, where the philosopher emperor, more at home with books than swords, will prove that whatever he'd rather be doing, he always did what needed to be done. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 93, The Marcomannic Wars. The victory over Parthia had been a double-edged sword. On the one hand, Rome had proven to their enemies that, whether or not the rumors were true that the empire was slipping into decline, for the moment, it was still the premier political, economic, and military force in the Western world. But on the other hand, the legions of Avidius Cassius, legions that had been so decisive in proving that point, had brought the devastating Antonine Plague back home with them. Thus, Rome's so recently re-established aura of invincibility was immediately shattered by an epidemic that hastened the pace of the empire's decline. In the end, it seems that labor shortages, famines, and undermanned legions were the only permanent spoils of war won by Rome in the conflict with Parthia. While these ill effects were not so immediately felt that the triumph over Parthia could be called a Pyrrhic victory, the conquest of the East definitely wound up a close cousin, as it was, after all, costly to the point of negating all benefit. Marcus had spent the years of the Parthian War in Rome, running every other part of the empire, while hostilities unfolded in the east. I didn't mention this last week, but just as the new Parthian invasion of Armenia, they were also forced to deal with two other crises right in their own backyard. In 162, after less than a year on the throne, the Tiber flooded, causing extensive damage to the capital and triggering catastrophic food shortages. Hunger and panic gripped the city, and both Marcus and Lucius, who was still in Italy at the time, had to scramble to initiate rescue, relief, and cleanup efforts. Both men received high marks for their response, and the suffering of the general population was kept as low as a disaster of that magnitude would allow. The other crisis that struck Rome in the early years of Marcus's reign was neither immediately recognized, nor, frankly, even suspected would become a crisis. In August 161, Faustina gave birth to twins. As so often happened with Roman children, one of the two, a boy named Titus, died in 165, having just barely emerged from infancy. This was a tragedy, but in the grand scheme of things, only a minor one. The far greater tragedy was that the other twin, a boy named Commodus, survived. But that time bomb wasn't set to go off for another 20 years, and for now, the emperor and the empire seemed blessed that this healthy young boy was managing to thrive in a world full of disease, famine, and war. During the early 160s then, while Rome was dealing with a series of disasters, both manifest and dormant, the challenge that would consume the second half of Marcus's reign was just beginning to come into its own. North of the Danube, the disparate German tribes were beginning to rethink their relationship with each other and question their greater relationship with Rome. After the massacre in the Teutoburg forest, the Romans had successfully prevented Arminius from uniting all the German tribes into a single force by exploiting the ascendant German leader's rivalry with the Marcomannic king Merobotus. Famously, when Arminius sent Varus's head to Merobotus in an attempt to persuade the Marcomanni to join him, the already co-opted Merobotus sent the head along to Augustus for burial. Without the necessary support from the Marcomanni, by far the strongest single tribe in southwest Germany, Arminius's coalition eventually collapsed, and the Romans did not face another serious threat from beyond the frontier for a century and a half. The basic Roman strategy of divide and conquer was never on better display than in Germany during the years of the early Principate. As I mentioned while discussing the construction of the Limes Germanicus, the Roman walls were not built to radically cut off, quote, civilization from, quote, the barbarians, but rather they were designed to control trade, limit available points of entry and exit, and serve as a base from which to project Roman power north and east. Roman interaction with the tribes was extensive and robust, and at all times, along with the economic exploitation, a political hand was kept stirring the pot and managing the loyalties of the Germans. Not only were some tribes given advantages over other tribes to keep their interests divergent, but elites within those favored tribes were often further enticed and divided from their own people, creating a condition where the tribes were divided from each other both internally and externally. Popular uprisings were suppressed by their own leadership, and hostile tribes were kept in check by their Roman allied neighbors, all without the Romans really having to lift a finger. These deft political machinations lie at the heart of what has occasionally and poetically been dubbed the Roman genius. Along with the discipline of the legions, the unparalleled skill of their engineers, the Roman ability to politically manipulate their enemies into submission was one of the great keys to the success of the empire. But the times, they were a-changin'. When the war with Parthia erupted, the Romans were forced to redeploy the legions to meet the threat. This meant that while the east was reinforced, the Rhine and Danube frontiers were depleted. Governors were forced to rely on locally raised militias rather than proper legions to maintain peace along the border, and it did not take long for the Germans to notice the shift. Though the Romans had for years been able to successfully buy off the tribal leadership, that did not mean that if there was more to get, that the various kings wouldn't jump at the chance to grab it. Some wanted unrestricted access to Roman markets, that is, exemption from import and export taxes. Some simply wanted increased cash tributes to keep their tribes loyal, while others wanted the whole hog, the right to migrate south into the empire proper, where, in time, they would become full-fledged citizens. With Roman attention diverted east, this might prove the perfect opportunity for the Germans to press for greater concessions. Against this backdrop, it is possible, though not a confirmed fact, that the Marcomannic king Balamar, technically a Roman appointee, began to sow the seeds for a combined German campaign against the Romans. There were dozens of tribes of various sizes living in and around the Roman border, and getting them all to act in concert with one another was like herding cats, but Balamar put out his feelers and began to get the sense that maybe he could cobble something together. Though his task was made nearly impossible by the years of intertribal enmity the Romans had stoked, it seems that by the time the Parthian campaign was wrapping up, Balamar had built up some kind of coalition that was willing to press the Romans from different sides at different times to achieve unified success. As I mentioned last time, in 166 or 167, a combined army of about 6,000 Germans broke across the border into Pannonia, causing all manner of havoc. They were eventually driven back across the Danube by a locally raised militia, but the surprise attack put the Romans on notice that there was renewed offensive energy brewing across the border. So the governor of Pannonia, Marcus Bassus, called together the heads of 11 German tribes for a summit mediated by Balamar, who was, at that point, still acting officially as an ally of Rome, and who had offered magnanimously to help smooth over the difficulties he himself was likely creating. The upshot of the talks was that the Marcomanni agreed to take the lead in maintaining the good order of their countrymen. Under the guise of this diplomatic peacekeeping mission, Balamar was able to secretly The same year as the summit, possibly at Balamar's order, possibly with his blessing, or possibly simply by pure coincidence, a combined force of Vandals and a Sarmatian tribe called, if I'm even pronouncing this correctly, the Azygis, invaded Moesia, killed the Roman governor, and then penetrated as far south as Greece before retreating back across the border laden with treasure. Of the two, the nomadic Azygis would prove to be the more permanent threat. Ironically, they had actually been brought into the dangerous territory they occupied between the Danube and Dacia by Trajan when they agreed to act as loyal clients during his war with the Cebalus. But once the war was over, and the Azygis found their migration routes blocked and hampered by the Romans, relations quickly deteriorated. Though they were technically classified as a client of Rome, the Azygis were more or less simply biding their time through the reigns of Hadrian and Antoninus, waiting for an opportunity to reassert their true independence. With the war in the east sapping Roman strength, and Balamar ready to press his case further west, opportunity seemed to be knocking. Though there had now been 2 successful invasions of imperial territory, the Romans had to delay whatever punitive measures they were planning, as they watched the Antonine Plague suck the life out of the legions,